Welcome, everyone, and hello from wherever you are. And I know some of us are really hot today in California. We're having a complete heat spell or heat wave, and so I'm really impressed to see all you here today and taking time out of your weekend to show up for women's equality. So welcome to the Women's Intercultural Network's Women's Equality Day event, 25 years making the global local. My name is Robin Endres, and I am the board president of the Women's Intercultural Network. And here with me today, co-facilitating, is our wonderful board secretary, Cathryn Harris-Marchesi.
Hello.
We're so, yay, Cathryn. We are so excited to celebrate Women's Equality Day and the gains that we have made in gender equality today with you all by hosting an inspiring dialogue with our esteemed panelists. All of these women have been on the front lines fighting for human rights and gender equality for decades. Today, they will take us on a journey starting in Beijing at the 4th World Conference on Women in 1995. Which many of them attended. And they will be sharing their firsthand accounts of that conference and how the Beijing Platform for Action took shape by women and allies coming together from around the world to create a collective action plan. All of our panelists have been a vibrant and vital part of WIN's history. A history founded by Marilyn Fowler 25 years ago, with her vision to bring the UN Beijing Platform for Action to local communities in California, the United States, and throughout the world. Driven by that vision, she created multiple interconnecting platforms from which women and girls can express their shared realities and network together to demand equitable policies and resources and full participation in our politics and economies. These platforms are comprised of the California Women's Agenda, CAWA, Cities for CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the U.S. Women's Caucus, now led by Susan Lee, the U.S. Women's Connect, and IC-WIN, the Iranian Circle of WIN, led by our very own Elahe Amani, and other global women's circles, as well as numerous delegations to the UN Women's Annual CSW Conference in New York, in which hundreds of WIN delegates have participated. So this year is not only a celebration of 25 years of the UN Beijing Platform for Action, but also a celebration of WIN's 25 years of action, transforming local communities through collective action, including in Uganda, Afghanistan, the Iranian diaspora, and indigenous communities throughout California. So as you can see, we have a very full agenda and we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand over the screen now to Cathryn, who will introduce herself and our panelists to lead our discussion. In the meantime, if you have questions that you have for our panelists during our Q&A period, please, I welcome you to type into our chat. Cathryn, you have the floor screen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robin.
You're welcome.
And we want to thank Robin for being such a wonderful leader for us too with WIN over this past while. My name's Cathryn Harris-Marchesi, as you heard, and I'm actually a civil rights attorney here in New York. I focus a lot on police brutality and women's issues such as sexual harassment and so forth. But let me start with our panelists. If I would like each of you, if you could please give us a 2-minute introduction as to who you are and the wonderful things you do. First of all, we'll start with Charlie Toledo.
I'm so glad to be with everybody here today. I'm the director of Susquehanna Intertribal Council since 1992, and I've also served off and on as WIN board chair for the last 20 years, but I'm currently the vice chair. I've sat on many delegations, international delegations, and advisory boards at state and national levels. In the Napa Valley, I'm a Towa descendant to Native Americans in New Mexico, and I have a lifetime dedicated to gender and ethnic equity, human rights for women and children. I was a delegate to the 1995 Beijing Conference for Women, where we gathered with 30,000 other women and girls to celebrate life and create goals for a bright future and to clearly define human rights for the international community. It was an amazing, amazing time. I'm glad to be here with everybody today.
Thank you so much, Charlie. And please, Elahe Amani, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Greeting to everyone. Glad to see friends here. Glad to see Marilyn. My name is Elahe Amani. I am Iranian American, and I came to US in 1974, actually a year before the first Women Conference, UN Women Conference. I served California State University system for 31 years in capacity of Women Studies lecturer and also Director of Academic Technology. I write frequently in Farsi and in English on women's human rights and human rights, broader human rights. And I'm a senior trainer of Mediators Beyond Borders. And we work on providing training globally on the intersection of gender and peace building and gender and mediation. In WIN, I've been with WIN since Beijing conference, so it's a celebration, quarter century celebration for me too. And I'm chair of Global Circles for Women's Intercultural Network. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elahe. Next, please, Emy Bermejo.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be with you today, and it's great to know that Marilyn Fowler is with us as well. I currently work for the governor of California, Governor Gavin Newsom, but I'm a longtime advocate and champion for women's rights. I serve on the board of the Women's Foundation of California. I'm a founder of the Women's Policy Institute, which was created to make sure that women in different communities had a voice in the legislative process so that we move policy. And we know that these kinds of efforts are always not for the faint of heart because it takes time, commitment, and never giving up. I also serve on the advisory board of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. In the past, I've served as chair of the California Commission on the Status of Women. I've helped found organizations like Emerge, the Emily's List Council for Latinas, and also serve on the San Francisco Commission on the Environment, where we look at some of the disparities between women in the environment and how disproportionately women, in particular women of color, are impacted. It's great to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Emy. And last but definitely not least, Julianne Cartwright-Taylor. Can you please introduce yourself?
Okay. My name is Julianne Cartwright-Taylor, and good afternoon. It's great to be here with you. It's a very important time to be celebrating Women's Equality Day. My background, I've been working on domestic civil rights and international human rights issues for decades. And especially since my student days in Berkeley and with my mentor, Frank C. Newman at UC Berkeley Law School. At the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, I was an official delegate for Human Rights Advocates. And that's an NGO that we found when we were students at Berkeley. I led the delegation for HRA to the governmental meeting and to the NGO forum in Wairau. With WIN, I interacted with WIN members in Beijing, and we'll be talking about some of those experiences. I've been on the board, I'm on the advisory board, and I led CAWA's Human Rights Task Force for years. And I've worked with WIN and our colleagues on the Cities for CEDAW, with WIN being the lead NGO, founding lead NGO. And I worked on the original San Francisco CEDAW resolution, which we passed in 1978. I work with a number of other NGOs like Amnesty International and, as I said, human rights advocates.
Thank you so much, Julianne. Before I ask our panelists the first question, I want to let everyone know that there will be about a 15-minute question and answer period at the end of this. And if you have a question you'd like to pose, if you would like to put it in the group chat, and Robin will be looking at some of the questions and picking the questions that we'll be answering. So please feel free to use the group chat for those purposes. The first question I'd like to ask, and I'm going to have Charlie answer this first, is if you could please explain why the UN Women Conference in Beijing, which was held 25 years ago, was so important, and what were the lasting impressions?
Well, it was a massive international celebration of women. It was one of the largest gathering of women, I think, in the history of our planet. There were over 30,000 women and children from around the world. We met in pre-organized actions and presentations. And after the first 2 or 3 days, it broke out into spontaneous actions and networking. So it just became this amazing, it was like being at a world fair. There was 30,000 women from every continent on the earth. There were so many languages being spoken. So a lot of spontaneous networking. But the most important thing is we had the eyes of the world upon us. It was an amazing opportunity to brainstorm in a public venue and to use that media attention to gain visibility for the issues that were important to us as women, as mothers, as, you know, husbands and children. We shared our collective vision of how we would like the world to be when there's equity and access for all the women and children. We set clear goals. This was the first time, really clear goals in the platform for action to improve our collective futures. We defined human rights. That's what the platform of action is. We defined what human rights actually are. Is universal access is the principle to healthcare, shelter, food, clean water, education, access to safety in our homes, in our schools, our workplaces, and streets. Economic equity would be achieved through access to leadership roles and power through the media. We imagined a future that has not yet been attained, even 25 years later. There are UN-sponsored annual convenings in New York City with the UNCSW. This would have been the 25th anniversary, and because of the pandemic, we were unable to meet, but we still are moving forward to develop language and policies that create positive changes that we work towards. We're still working towards attaining the goals that we set back in 1995. So the convenings, we come together to talk about what are the barriers and what are the successes. Like I was saying earlier, we had to do that virtually, and that was just a few weeks ago because the March convening got canceled. It was amazing to see how the rest of the world is moving forward, and the United States, due to our current situations, is kind of being left out of the loop. But the rest of the world is moving towards equity and setting clear, defined goals, and that's an amazing, amazing thing to be a part of.
Yes, most definitely. Elahe, could you please share your thoughts and comments for us?
Well, actually, Beijing conference, as Charlie mentioned, it was the biggest gathering with 30,000 men and 400 men. 400 men also participated in the Beijing conference. For me personally, it was a gathering that I was waiting for it for 10 years because I intended and registered to attend a Nairobi conference. But because of some issues, family issues, I couldn't attend Nairobi. So I waited 10 years for Beijing. And to me, it was a conference that brought hope for achieving gender equality to many women around the globe. And it was a symbolic moment of feminist possibility. And we all went there with sisterhood is global and women's solidarity. In a sense, the Beijing platform for action, it's even relevant today as we are talking about it. And because it's the strongest statement of consensus on women's equality, empowerment, and justice ever produced by government. That's why we never had the 5th World Conference, because particularly women from South, women from Africa, Asia, and Latin America collectively, and I was part of that discussion, that if we come for the 5th conference, because of the rise of religious extremism and the right-wing populist movement around the world, we're gonna have a step back. That's why we had Beijing +5, we had Beijing +10, Beijing +15, 20, and now quarter century Beijing +25. So it was an amazing, it was the document that Beijing conference produced. It's 131 pages, and it's one of the most progressive document for women's human rights at international level. I recall that there was heated discussion on gender equality versus equity, because Vatican, Iran, and a couple of the countries in Latin America, they were opposing to the term of gender equality. They were going to put the gender equity as a language in the document, but the document refers to gender equality and in some parts equity. So it was we all were wearing a fake jade key necklace, because women were agent of change at the conference. It was amazing. Every year there were 400 workshops and gathering that that brought women together. And I did a workshop at the Beijing conference. The title was Women's Human Rights and Islam, and in some area why they are conflicting or other things. Anyway, it was a very important conference for equal access to education, employment opportunity, healthcare, political sharing, and for the first time in any document in the world, the terminology of the girl child was produced in a document. Prior to that, if we were talking about nutrition, we were giving the statistics about this many children are malnutrition around the world. This was the first time that the girl child is one of the 12 areas of concern in the Beijing document, because we see that in any aspect of the 12 area of concern for Beijing, there is a gap between woman and man, even between girl child and boy child.
Thank you so much, Elahe. And again, now Julianne, could you please give us your thoughts?
Yes, and hello, Marilyn. The goal of the conference was gender equality and the empowerment of women, and as we said, girls everywhere in the world. And the commitments that were made in Beijing by the government were historic in scope. The NGOs who were there kept the pressure on government delegations. They were networking, they were lobbying, and they kept the media spotlight on what we were doing in Beijing and Wairau. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is constitute the most progressive blueprint ever for advancing women's rights. And today it stands as a still powerful source of guidance and inspiration. Now, some of my personal impressions, to see the energy among the NGOs. And I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I live in Oakland. And I left from the Oakland airport. And I knew that the meeting was going to be exciting for me also as an African American, when I saw a family, 3 generations of African American women and girls in one family on their first trip out of the country going to the Beijing conference. And that was exciting for me to see. Beijing, and I mentioned Wairau and Beijing. I commuted from the government meeting in Beijing to Wairau. And obviously, and I know all of us remember Hillary Clinton's speech and Madeleine Albright's work. Women's rights are human rights are women's rights. And the refrain that we had, that there will be no turning back. And that was one of our anthems there. So for me, those are some of the impressions. And coming from the US, there were over 8,000 delegates from the US, and at least 1,000 were African American. And so that was something that was very rewarding for me to see and to experience, and to know afterwards how energized we all were coming back to San Francisco, working with WIN, COWA, the San Francisco CEDAR resolution, and also structural changes within the UN system to strengthen the role and the emphasis on women's human rights there. So those are some of my impressions.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to think of such a great conference with people from all different backgrounds and all different ethnicities being in one spot. Our second question is going to be, and I'm going to pose it to you first, Charlie. We're going to be going in the same order. How is the Beijing platform for action relevant today?
Okay, I want to say that Elmy's part of our panel also. So I don't know.
Well, the reason we did not, the reason we skipped over Emy was not at the Beijing conference.
Thank you so much. Okay, I appreciate that clarification. So how the Beijing conference is relevant today is it set clearly defined goals that we collectively at local, regional, and international levels continue to work towards. We work to create systemic infrastructure to stabilize these goals into everyday life for all the women and children of the world. From annual convenings, we are mostly inspired to work locally. That was another statement that came out of Beijing. You know, think global, work local, because that's the only time you really have human rights is if you have it in the community where you live, and what you do. So the goals will become and are becoming a universal reality with the basic needs of shelter, water, healthcare, and safety for everyone on this earth. The language, I think we can't speak enough about language, and that's what makes the Beijing conference so relevant, is the language that was developed from there and continues to get fine-tuned, because if we can't speak about a problem, we can't really understand it and move towards solutions. And I think the basis that we started really very strongly in Beijing, again, 30,000 women, we were all leaders in our community. So when we went home, that began this kind of like an earthquake fracture. The whole patriarchal system was affected at every level and is still being affected. Even though it hasn't emerged as the dominant presence that we have equity and ethnic and gender equity, we're moving towards it, and we have the words to move towards it. And there's so many policies internationally and nationally in the countries of the world that have changed as a result and are still changing. So that's the relevance. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm someone who focuses a lot on language, and I very much agree that language is so essential in the way that we address things and our ability to be able to express ideas. Elahe, please, could you let us know about what your view is on the relevance?
Sure. I think 20 years in 21st century, while when we look back, while the progress has been made, and 143 countries as of 2020 guaranteed equality between men and women in their constitution, the world is still staggering unequal for women. That's the reality. 25 years after the declaration was made, Beijing Platform for Action, UN members, again, in March that we were all gonna get together for Beijing Plus 25, but because of COVID, that gathering never happened. But they committed to invest heavily in measuring and reaching gender equality. And 25 years after Beijing conference, globally, women activists, human rights advocates, and civil society NGOs, collectively, we agree that women's rights has not gone fast and far enough. As we have inequality from US, from here where we live, to Iran, to Bangladesh, to other countries of the world. So we have come a long way, but we have a longer way to go. And still, in many aspects of women's life, we still see extreme poverty, majority of the poor people, and in every country of the world. Every country of the world, the poor people are women. A majority of the refugees and migrants that they are roaming around the world from fleeing from different disaster, from natural disaster or authoritarian government, they are women, and women still have less access to health, including in United States. I was just reading this morning that the number of fatality because of COVID is twice among African American compared to the rest of population. So we still have a lot of disparity, and Beijing Platforms for Action is a blueprint that can guide us towards gender equality, empowerment of women, peace, and a more harmonious way. The other thing I was going to mention that is still on the agenda 25 years after Beijing is that collectively, with the luxury that we have from internet information technology and accessing, like we all getting here to Zoom, I think it's our responsibility to make change collectively happen and reach out to, in every community we live, we reach out to people and then educate people about their rights, and collectively we move forward. I think Beijing Platform of Action is relevant today as it was in 1995, and we should hold tight to that document and just make it further in achieving equality and empowerment of women.
Thank you so much, Elahe. And now, Emy, can you give us your thoughts, please, on the relevance today?
Thank you, Catherine. And as was stated, I was sadly not at Beijing. However, you all have heard that there was an unprecedented 17,000 participants, 30,000 activists that streamed into Beijing for the opening of the Fourth World Conference on Women in September of 1995. And that primarily for me is that they were diverse, coming from around the globe. And the single purpose was gender equality and the empowerment of all women everywhere. And you've heard about the debate that is representatives of 189 governments hammered out commitments. And all of these folks and all these women and men who came together, and that by the time the conference closed, it had produced the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is the most progressive blueprint ever for advancing women's rights. The Platform for Action made comprehensive commitments under 12 critical areas of concern. And I'm just gonna list them, and those are women in the environment, women in power and decision-making, the girl child, women in the economy, women in poverty, violence against women, human rights of women, education and training of women, institutional mechanisms for the advancement of women, women in health, women in the media, and women in armed conflict. This unleashed a remarkable political will and worldwide visibility, reinforced the activism of women's movements around the world. And it sounds like people went home, women went home with great hope and a clear agreement. And so when you think about the relevance of these 12 declarations after 25 years, I think in particular about women in power and decision-making. And it will not miss the opportunity to state that this week, Vice President Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, selected California Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate, a historic pick. Senator Harris is of Black and South Asian descent, the first woman of color on a national ticket. I had the privilege of knowing her over 20 years ago. And when she first told me that she was running for San Francisco District Attorney, I said, how can I help? And I remember she said, get good walking shoes. Good advice. I walked precincts. And when she ran for Attorney General, I took a day off from work. And I said to her, I'm going to staff you. I will drive you around, because there wasn't a lot of, people sort of want to go with who they know, right? And she was at that point, not many people knew her. So we went to LA and I staffed her at meetings and all these other things, and have the also know her commitment to women and how she supports women. She was an early endorser of now Lieutenant Governor Elahe Amani, the first woman ever elected to be Lieutenant Governor in the state of California. I'm very proud to say that I helped Elahe in that race, and she won by 13 points, but who's counting? And I think when you think about the historic naming or selection of Senator Kamala Harris, it's just goes to that idea that we have to be at decision-making tables, at the highest decision-making tables, because everything that is happening in the state capitol impacts every woman and child, no matter what the issue is. And so, yes, the Beijing platform is alive and well. And I'll leave you with a quote. This week, a friend of mine, Emy Ruiz, who's a key advisor on the Biden-Harris campaign and also worked for Hillary Clinton, said it best, I believe, when she said that Biden is fighting to restore the soul of our nation, and Kamala Harris shows the promise of our nation that has not yet been fulfilled. I think that for me personally, there's an opportunity to really create change, because I think that will send a ripple effect for a lot of women, a lot of little girls who continue to think that they have a place at the table. So I think that is an exciting time, but all of these 12 declarations continue to be very relevant each and every day. And I look forward to working with all of you to continue on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Emy. And Julianne, could you please let us know your thoughts?
Right, and it's a good segue from what Emy was saying. I think the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action are still totally relevant today, because we're still working to achieve these goals. And Emy mentioned the 12 critical areas of concern in the Platform for Action. I won't repeat them here now, but I think we look at all of these critical areas of concern, all within the context of human rights. Mm-hmm. Human rights is a cross-cutting issue that affects all of the other issue areas and how they are implemented. The Platform for Action is still a blueprint for action. We've had some progress, still more actions are needed. And fortunately, we have new generations of activists that have emerged to carry on the work that we started 25 years ago in Beijing.
Thank you so much, Julianne. And our last and final question before we go to questions from all of our audience is, how do local actions focused on gender equality intersect with other movements, such as climate justice, the digital divide, and access to healthcare? Could you please start, Charlie?
Sure. I'm happy. We all had these three questions, and I was just saying when we started, what if we all have the same answers, but we don't? So that's great. I was hoping other people would get to fill the details in. But I just am focusing my comments on the language that was developed through these defined goals. It had created a language that's common today. People, especially younger people, don't realize that we didn't talk like we're talking now. Healthcare is a human right. That came out of CAO. I remember the first time I said that from a state at San Francisco State with delegates from around the state and the country. Healthcare is a human right. It was the first time it was spoken in a public venue about 20 years ago. Access to clean water as a human right. That's been established now. The state of California has endorsed that. Terms like gender and ethnic equity. Those phrases just coming out of the most recent convening. Social justice. Those are, again, common language usage. 20 years ago, people didn't talk like that. Underserved and unserved communities have gained visibility. That's my primary concern as an Indigenous person in the remote rural populations of the world and indigenous people. I spoke about my earlier statements, how there was a lot of spontaneous workshops that occurred, and there was a tent. There was no place for indigenous people at this women's convening. And so the indigenous people, being as adaptive and resilient as ever, created their own space. And there was 1,000 of us that gathered for 9 days to develop the similar language specific to the indigenous people of the world. They were communities that did not have access to decision-making through the media or governments. I was part of that indigenous community for 9 days, 1,000 women from every continent that petitioned the UN for representation, as indigenous people have been petitioning the UN since 1939, the League of Nations, when it formed in New York. This treaty was accepted. It took 5 years before it was realized, and 2 permanent committees were set up. So indigenous people of the world now have 2 permanent committees that they can file their grievances and their statements with. We do not still have a vote or a position on the floor. That is still a goal, but it's the first time ever. All these languages and goals emerged from the 1995 Beijing Conference. Climate justice is a human right. These are not intersected so much as the same thing. What I've been working locally and my whole life really to do is to get the local community in Napa Valley, which is very typical as the affluent people of the world. They are the ones who receive all the goodness of all of the predation that goes on globally. We are the benefiting. As an indigenous person living in this community, I've had to deal with police harassment from the FBI. When I went to an international conference, I was the one who was seated next to a CIA agent on the flight over from San Francisco airport. We were being followed by cars with heavily tinted windows, that when we would be in our little groups, the window would open and we were being filmed. And I remember saying to one of my friends, "Who do you think that is?" And they said, "Wow, we're at an international conference. It could be the KGB, it could be the Chinese government, it could be the CIA." We didn't know. We have been watched and since the beginning of the industrial age. We now have representation, and we are the voice of the environment. We are the voice of the earth. Say one earth and everything is connected, one water, one earth, one forest, one fire. These are terms that are common in an indigenous worldview. They have and are being returned as the guiding light to bring balance among ourselves and all sentient life forms that we share this earth with. It's not just about the 2-leggeds, it's about the 4-leggeds, the tree people, the winged ones, all the creatures of the seas and the rivers. It all is connected. We are all talking about the same thing. So my life work has been to help people that are working on environmental issues and social justice issues to realize, no, this is all part of that same platform. It all is the basis of human rights.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charlie. We'll move on to Elahe. Could you please give us your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the reasons that I am so excited and honored to stay with Women's Intercultural Network is because of the vision of people who shape the path of Women's Intercultural Network. One of the brilliant things that it's formulated by the leadership, including Marilyn Fowler, was we are not an organization that network. We are a network that we are organizing. And that is so brilliant because not only we use network to organize people, but we also bring global to local. I want to share that since Beijing conference, as an expert witness on domestic violence, we have used in the courts of Los Angeles, we have used the text and the language of the violence against women from the Beijing conference for cases in the courts locally. We have used, in many countries, women are using the language in Beijing conference, the human rights framework for pushing and holding the governments accountable. Prior to Beijing, perhaps the perception was human rights is, or Declaration of Human Rights or other human rights document are books that you file in your library. It was after the Beijing that globally women felt that this is not something that should be filed in the library. It's a tool that we can hold our governments accountable. We can hold in any part of the world these documents, this international body, including CEDAW, which regretfully, neither the country that I was born, nor the country that I am resident and I am citizen of it, United States, neither Iran nor United States have not ratified CEDAW. And it was a really brilliant idea of Merlin and other leadership when we were all at the CSW in 2013. We said, well, United States has signed but never ratified CEDAW, so we push it up from the grassroots to the federal level. And that's why Cities for CEDAW was established, which many cities, more than 100 cities in United States currently have passed a resolution on an ordinance on CEDAW, including San Francisco and Los Angeles as two brilliant examples of Cities for CEDAW implementation. So there are many aspects of it that we brought global to local. Also, we take local to global. I remember a few years ago when the theme for Commission on the Status of Women was agrarian women. We spent the weekend in Fresno with farm workers, women, and WIN organized a group, and we took them to New York, the farm workers and their constituency, so to speak firsthand to the global scene about the harmful practices and chemicals and all the challenges that they are facing in their daily life. So not only we brought global, local, we also took local to global to these international conferences. And I recall that in one of the post-Beijing conferences in Cuba that I attended in 1998, that was the whole discussion about bringing global to local and taking local to global. And we are taking local to global too in many aspects. We are taking the challenges on environment. Recently, Iranian women are taking the wave of honor killings to global and working with UN to have a campaign, global campaign to address violence against women. So they are this dynamic of local to global and global to local is very dynamic process, and we all take part of it. And WIN, I think the vision and formulated strategies of WIN has been brilliant.
Thank you very much, Emy. And now, sorry, Elahe, we're going to Emy now. I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Could you please give your thoughts on the intersectionality?
Yes, thank you for that. And yes, that was an amazing thing to take women and girls from Tulare County to New York to talk about their experiences working in basically an area that feeds not only California, the nation, and the world. When it comes to the intersectionality, I also want to focus on climate change, and in particular with women of color, from breathing toxic fumes while burning fuel to cook, to chemicals that we touch while working in factories or nail salons. Women, in particular women of color, pay a heavy price. Additionally, we are often the ones gathering water, fishing, farming the land affected by flooding. The voices are often not heard or simply ignored in environmental planning and management. In the US, we are seeing an increase in wildfires and superstorms linked to climate change. And we know that women and children around the world are 14 times more likely to die during a natural disaster than men. I serve on the commission, San Francisco Commission on the Environment. And frankly, given the absence of some leadership in DC, the leadership of cities is more important than ever. Once again, the global, local, etc. And San Francisco has proved that you can be a sustainable city and prior to COVID-19, maintain a growing economy, too early to see what the numbers are going to be in terms of that. But San Francisco has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% since 1990, while at the same time, our economy grew by 111% and our population by 20%. Again, these are pre-COVID numbers. Now, these reductions were a result of commitments that were made in San Francisco to change business as usual. We successfully shut down 2 of California's dirtiest and most inefficient fossil fuel power plants in the city. We scaled up our energy efficiency work to reduce overall energy use in large commercial buildings. And we set ambitious goals of achieving 100% renewable energy by 2030 by launching Clean Power SF, a program which delivers clean energy to residents and to businesses throughout San Francisco. As a result of all these efforts, San Francisco is on its way to a renewable energy future, but we must continue to push for further things. And San Francisco has adopted some bold commitments. Those include reducing waste, decarbonizing buildings, accelerating 100% renewable energy adoption, and encouraging more sustainable investments. So once again, you you can see how acting at the local level is really bringing the global local, and then a two-way street in the local global. So we continue to push for that. And that's just one area that I wanted to focus on what my city in San Francisco is doing. And also just wanted to point out that now Governor Newsom was Mayor Newsom at the time that CEDAW was adopted in our beautiful city of San Francisco. Thank you.
So Cathryn left the screen, so I'll go ahead and recognize Juliana. Do you want to talk about the intersectionality? Thank you, Emy, brilliant. You have to unmute your microphone, Julianne. Unmute your microphone. The little red, the little cat, little, there we go.
One of the hazards of speaking after 3 very strong women and colleagues and is the threat of repeating things. So I've been editing what I was going to say because of that. But I think one common thread that we're talking about, global to local, local to global. And for many decades, I would go to United Nations meetings and sit and interact with government delegates and draft language in terms of resolutions, only to come back to the US and to see how the commitments weren't adhered to, or the fact that the number of people domestically were not interested in what was going on the international level, or didn't know anything about what was going on the international level. And me, with my colleagues, for example, human rights advocates and whatever, having to do a lot of human rights education of what we were doing on the international level. Thank goodness for WIN and WIN post Beijing to come back and to bring back our knowledge and our commitments to the local area, to keep the pressure up on our government to implement the commitments that they made in Beijing. I think today one only needs to look at the newspaper or hear the news about how women and girls, and especially women of color, and especially African-American women, are being disproportionately affected by COVID-19, including issues that we're talking about, climate justice, digital divide, and access to health care. And you can also think about education, economics, jobs, and what have you. So what we've been talking about is definitely still valid. This whole intersectionality that we're talking about, not only of race, gender, and class, but these other factors that we're talking about. And I've been privileged to be part of WIN, as WIN has fostered working with various cultural, ethnic groups. And you all have mentioned when you took some of the rural women to delegations on the WIN delegation to the Commission on the Status of Women. And just WIN's work globally with the global circles and trying to bring women together in the circles around common issues, because we find when we get together with other women and allies in New York or Beijing or what have you, we do have a lot of commonalities in our areas where we live. So intersectionality, of course, global, local, and local back to global, because we need to inform our colleagues internationally. And as we used to say in Amnesty International, shine a light of shame on countries, including our own country. Some of you have mentioned we haven't ratified CEDAW. A WIN delegation did go to Geneva to talk about women's rights issues in the US, but as a non-governmental organization, because there wasn't, the US hasn't ratified CEDAW, so we don't have an expert on that committee that implements the provisions of CEDAW. So these are some of my thoughts, both domestically on the work that we're doing and internationally. So the global to the local and back to the international arenas.
Thank you so much, Juliana, and all the panelists for your thoughts. We're going to now start the question and answer period, so I'm going to pass it back over to Robin. Thank you, Robin.
Great, thank you, everyone. We don't have any questions yet in the chat, but I'm just gonna invite everyone to turn on their video so we can all see each other, have a little moment of celebration. And then if you do have a question, please feel free to physically raise your hand or raise your hand through Zoom. And I know that I have questions. Oh, and then we have Jane already has or no, sorry, you're just turning on your light. I thought you had a question. You do have a question. Okay, go ahead, Jane. Yes, go ahead. You can unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself, Jane.
Listen and then do it.
There you go. Okay,
good?
Great, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Excellent. One of the things that I think, and Robin, I think that you and I, as we were walking around one of the events down there in City Hall this last spring, one of the things that we observed was there doesn't seem to be a great deal of publicity and information in our community that comes out to people. So these were wonderful, in-depth, clear discussions of needs and actions. And two things that when Marilyn was in charge, I know that there was a group at the state level of women who were legislators that were interested in the issues. And that, and I also think that locally, that over a period of time, and I can't be really specific because I'm not a great watcher of the news in terms of print, but I think that it would be very useful for the positions that were stated and the information, if somehow that were translated into information for the public. A tough call, but in a way to say, if we could get some inroads and get some relationships established there, I think it would make a difference. And of course, we're in the midst of COVID and there's a lot going on, but I would love to see that the state level prospects restored, and then and just more information going on locally, news and in other outlets. So that was more a statement, but it sort of followed with, how can we do that for ourselves and for our women's community?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, really need the media to be an ally in this effort. So I love that idea, and if anyone else wants to follow up on that comment or has any or is from the media, that'd be wonderful. Anyone else?
One thing that I want to say, I'm not a Facebook person. I don't post a lot on Facebook, but I sure do see a lot of excellent information on Facebook and other social media. So I think it's just chatting with groups that are talking about these issues, and they usually give some kind of website for their information and for their organizations. And then there are some stations. I know we all suffer from fatigue sometimes, talking about COVID-19 fatigue and fatigue with the administration in DC, to put it lightly, and have to turn off from there. But I agree with you, Jane, that we do need that, and more people need to pay attention to a lot of these human rights issues. But a lot of us are so busy doing that we don't take enough time to try to sit and think and then spread the work that we're doing. But there's some excellent outlets there, but Jane, I agree, we need to do more.
All right, thank you, Julianne. Kathleen, do you have a question?
Mute myself. It's not so much a statement as to go to what Jane has said and to what Julianne. I think we have to look, we're in a whole new world when it comes to the media now. The media has been going through a lot. So our conventional ways that we've been talking about are not as effective. But you fast forward to now, what I'm observing as a communication specialist, as a media, what have you, and just even locally as well as going globally. At the last UN Commission conference commission meeting, there were some interesting sessions on global media focusing on women. There were some great things and great outlets. But what occurred to me was, and I've gone and followed now, filing incredible stories that are addressing all of these things. But the question is, who do we know about them, and how are they getting to the other group? Well, fast forward, and that's been interesting to me. I just came out of an editorial board meeting working with, on behalf of the League of Women Voters. And I was working with the Bay City News. It's a news service. You would think conventional, but taken over about a year ago by a woman who is very committed to the issues and what have you. And what she and others have created is a whole foundation called Local News Matters. And what they're trying to do is file and have stories there that are addressing issues, the women's issues, the voting issues, whatever. And they're very, very, and as a news service, they're getting those stories out to all the other media. And one of the things that we talked about was it's important for us now to let people know that that outlet is there and that that is a source for them to be able to file. So to go to your point, Jane, and what have you, this is not something we hope can happen. If we want it to happen, we're going to have to be more aggressive, and we're going to have to start filing. But there are outlets out there, and it's the constant challenge is, how do you get all this online outlets to our community at large? And I know that I'm involved in a whole group of what we call voter collaborative. And we're working with all just within the city of Oakland, just one, trying to work with all the other community groups and saying, look, here's information, here's whatever, how do we get to our community? And I think you talk about global to local and local up. I think that's it. But it's there, it's just that we have to do it in a different way. Facebook is great,
Yeah.
and so, the social media, Instagram, it's all, and we're working with a lot of community groups. So it's ongoing. It's ongoing.
Yeah. Thank you,
and
Kathleen.
worthy.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kathleen. Anyone else with a question?
Susan has
Yes,
a question.
Susan. Yes.
Hi, hello all.
Hi, Susan. Great to see you.
Nice to see you, and a special hello to Marilyn Fowler.
Yes, yes.
In this meeting. I had another question, and I don't know if this is too broad, but thinking about what California did following Beijing, establishing the California Women's Agenda, trying to move California ahead using the principles of the Beijing platform. I wonder, could we establish a U.S. women's agenda, and what would what would the elements of it be? Trying to make the Beijing platform real in the United States, because of course the Beijing platform speaks differently to different countries depending on the the complexion of that country. What the position of women is in that country. So thinking about the U.S. and the Beijing platform, what would the elements of a U.S. women's agenda be? Yeah. And I just wonder if the panelists or others would like to respond to that.
Yeah. I know that I'm sure that Charlie can speak to that. I'm sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know that you're very involved in CAWA.
We have already done that movement. I think the access to the media, when we're convening annually, we look at the barriers. So one of the barriers that we have in the United States is access to the media. We don't have access to the international community. And that's why for us that are involved with the UN, we get to have hope because we see what the rest of the world is doing and how they are progressing for the least of people to have access and equity. And they've added to the agenda this year the goal of meeting the goals, the lofty platform goals of Beijing in this next decade. The UN is dedicating this decade to the development of reaching and attaining all these goals universally for every place on this earth. CAWA, the United States was too big. When we went to Beijing, we came back, we were full of hope and dreams. And all the delegates that came back, like we talked about from the Bay Area, was a large group, hundreds of people, 1,000 of people from California. And everybody got really depressed. So I was asked to do a blessing. And I had 3 minutes and I said, went to the future and now we've come back to the present, and the present is so sad and the future looks so far away. So the only thing that we can do is just be where we are right now and take the next possible step. And if that step isn't successful, to step back and take a smaller step. And if that one doesn't succeed, to step back again. So initially we were committed, I think, as the delegations from all the delegates from the United States, to get the United States to sign that treaty, which they never did. The United States has not signed or committed to the Beijing platform. And so then we said, okay, let's get the state of California to commit. And that was another unsuccessful venue. So then what we did, and that was Prashante Amaran, who lives now in New York, but she was living in San Francisco. And she said, well, Charlie said, let's take it to the smallest step. So I'm going to have a city sign this international treaty. And her friends, all her lawyer friends, human rights lawyers, international lawyers in New York were saying, a city cannot sign an international treaty. And she said, her comment to that was, they can if they do. And it was Mayor Willie Brown who signed the cities for seat on the Beijing platform. And then Newsom, the now Governor Newsom, was the superintendent, the chair, and he put a budget behind it. That was 12 years ago. So San Francisco then has become the international model for how you take these lofty goals, these broad-based goals, and bring them down to the city where you live. And so right now, I think the global strategy is to focus very locally. Climate change is going to bring us into isolation. So the communities where we live, our neighbors and our families, those are going to be our lines to survival and adaptation. We are going to be cut off from each other as we are during the fires, as we are during the natural disasters. Napa County has been ground zero for natural disasters. In the last 5 years, we've had a major earthquake. We had 7 major floods that cut us off from each other, little islands within the city and the valley, and then with the rest of the world. The pandemic is another issue. The fires that we've had, the same thing happened. Where we're in the fires, we need knowledge. Where can we go? How fast can we get there? I mentioned just very obliquely that I sit on a lot of boards. I sit on a lot of state boards, and I was staying at the state level. I'm not going to define them all because it gets too lengthy. That we have to adapt, and people will start, and they already have started internationally, to move to areas that are safe given climate change. Areas are going to be too hot to live in. There's already islands and places close to the shores that are the saltwater's incursioning into the freshwater. That's happening in California. It's happening in Fiji. It's happening in Samoa. It's happening in a lot of parts of the world, Jamaica. They're already having to move and relocate. So I was seeing this at this one state board, and the water commissioners, all these state people, they were kind of laughing at me saying, well, you're talking, you know, board member Toledo, you're referring to the Los Angeles Basin. And I said, I know I'm referring to the Los Angeles Basin. All those people moved there in the last 20 years, and they will move if they need to. And in between the meetings, we had these massive firestorms. And I told the board when we had our open mic, I said, I just want to refer back to our last meeting, last quarter, when we were talking about populations relocating due to disasters. I have to tell you, when those firestorms were hitting Napa and Lake County and Sonoma County, people were running as fast as they possibly could to move out of the area of danger. We already know firsthand, like I said, I've been in, I think, 10 natural disasters in 20 years. The community where you live is who you depend on. It's very important to know your neighbors. It's very important to have an exit plan from your home and from your town should a natural disaster hit. So we can, I think right now, that the world is shrinking, and given the disaster, the climate change that is imminent, that we're in the midst of, we have to focus all of our attention locally in the communities where we live, and bring these lofty goals, these 12 things that have been so well expressed on this panel today, to the town, to the city, to the village where you live. This is happening in the rest of the world. 2 weeks ago, we were able to tap into the international conference, which ended up being a Zoom platform like this. People from around the world, minus the United States, were speaking about this, and speaking, especially addressing the issue of climate change, because that is our eminent, and we will pull together. So I think for us, we all have to feel, where are we called to act? What can we do where we sit and live right now? And then begin to do it. There's no hero coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. The first time I was in a massive flood and we had to flee our home in the middle of the night with 2 young children and all of our rabbits and chickens and my dogs and cats, threw them in the car, moved out of town, and then just accessed how we could get back in. We knew we were on our own. Nobody was there. People said, oh, when the flood comes, they come to tell you. There's no they. There's nobody coming to tell us. And our leaders, certainly in the United States, are not telling us. So we really have to find that leadership within ourselves, within our, and then move forward from there. So I think we're not looking so much to the nation. We're looking to our states and our counties, our cities, our villages, our towns. That's really where it will become universal. If everybody and the rest of the world is committed to this, they're already doing it. So the United States, we're going to be forced into it whether we want to or not. So anyway, maybe a little too much drama for the afternoon.
Thank you, Charlie. That was wonderful. Yes. Yes. Elahe, did you have a
I was going to make a quick response to what Susan suggested. I totally agree, Susan. That's going to be a very good idea. Actually, in 1996, and I remember the moment that this question, one of my students asked me that question. I was talking about Beijing document as part of Women Studies program. And one of the students said, do we have a program for United States, what we need to do? So it was you know, your words remind me of what that student in 1996 told me, that do we have agenda for United States? The other thing is, if I recall correctly, when we went to Beijing, there was an interagency, president interagency, that was managing these global conferences and managed even Nairobi conference and Beijing conference, but that agency does not exist, and it hasn't been in existence for the past 2.5 decades.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's a good point too. Like, how do we, you know, so much talk right now about structural change and dismantling the racist and misogynist, xenophobic structures that we currently have. How do we, what are the structures that we can use now to rebuild, you know, using the Beijing Platform for Action, for example. And I really enjoyed kind of before or the other comment I really liked of yours, Elahe, is when you talked about using the Beijing platform in a local environment to fight for domestic violence survivors. And I think that's a great example of really how each one of us, when we're in any type of situation in our own community, can take those take everything that's in the Beijing platform or those items in the Beijing Platform for Action and use them in targeted ways. So I think that was a really great point. Yeah. Go ahead, Julianne.
Yes, and I totally agree with what you were saying, Elahe. I think that we're seeing a new era of activism now, especially in the demonstrations, in the streets, the elections of people who are talking about these issues of economic justice, healthcare, climate change. They are using, when I hear the slogans, I hear human rights. I hear the word. I hear healthcare is a human right. Education is a human right. The right to work is a human right. So the language is there. New advocacy groups are using that language, and I think it's for us to build on it, whether or not you're talking about the Black Lives Matters writ large, or other activism and advocacy group, but they're talking about what we've been talking about today, and they're discovering human rights issues. We knew this all along, and we've been talking about these issues all along, but now with the disparities so acute in the US and globally, but we're talking about the local area, I think that there is hope for us to try to capture the moment and the momentum going forward to talk about these issues that we have been discussing today in order to achieve those goals that we talked about in Beijing, and to still work on implementing those today and going forward.
Yeah, awesome. Wonderful. Wonderful. Oh, yes, go ahead, Alice. Great to see you.
Of all the items on the platform, where has the most progress happened and where?
That's a great question. So the question is, of all the items on the platform, where has the most progress been made? Does someone want to take that from our panel?
I can respond to that.
Yes, go ahead, Elahe.
Well, based on the global statistics, UN statistic, the area that Beijing goals was achieved more is on education. Currently, the gap between in elementary schools is pretty much closed globally between girl childs and boy childs, and to some degree to middle school. But as we go to high school, we still see a gap in terms of education of boys and girls. The other area is that that many countries, more than 100 countries since Beijing conference, have taken legal action to make violence against women an unlawful act, to make it a crime. Of course, there are many different aspects to it, but actually still some country, they don't have any law on violence against women, and women lives are being endangered at home or in public place, in private and public spheres because of the violence. But many countries took specific action on that in their legal system. Also, in Beijing conference, in terms of political participation of women, there were some goals set that every country have to have at least 1/3 of their legislative body being a woman. So it was discussed at the Beijing that if we have 1/3, we have critical mass. So on that, unfortunately, US is still, we have made progress, particularly recently, but we still are 75 of the 198 countries in the world. We are number 75. So we're not even in top 10. So there are areas that globally we have made advancement in violence against women, not prior to Corona, of course. Corona gave a rise in a step back on violence against women globally. But education is probably the area that most countries have took a specific action. And as I said, one of the good things is that the gap between elementary, between boys and girls are pretty much closed.
Thank you. Charlie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was waving bye to some of the people that were.
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to add.
But no, I did want to make a comment. Healthcare is another place where there's so much. Most countries of the world, all the developed nations except the United States, have universal healthcare. So that's been another one that's had a huge amount of progress. And just at the state level, human trafficking has finally been made illegal. It wasn't illegal in the United States or California, and that's just been in the last 5 years. So I think most of the points are going forward. Obviously, media is at the back of the line, but healthcare is another one where, except for the United States, most countries have that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Hi. Go ahead.
Hi.
June Marie, how are you? Go ahead.
Hi. Great to see everyone, and thank you for putting this together. My question is, with the initiatives that the initiative that WIN has taken and other organizations around Cities for CEDAW, I'm wondering if there is any policy organization or institute that's doing any tracking or metrics on cities who have passed at the local level, because I'm finding that that's the biggest challenge I have. I mean, it's great that we have a lot of resolutions, but we have very few ordinances. And the pushback on really getting those things implemented seems to be that there's very little in the way of metrics regarding like what have been the implications. I know that there was a study after San Francisco, and there's been some kind of ancillary or anecdotal kinds of outcomes, but I'm just wondering, since then, since people have started to put money behind it and we've had a few more cities that have actually passed ordinances, where is that progress being tracked and how can I tap into it?
That's a great question. And I know that each city is different and tracking it differently. So, but I know Elahe can add to this, I'm sure. Do you have,
well, I know city of Los Angeles after San Francisco is one of the best example of implementing CEDAW, not in LA County, of course, it's just in LA City. And there are a lot of good things happening, because I know people work in city and they come and say, well, they send this and that. And I say, well, that's CEDAW implementation. So a lot of good things are happening in LA, but in terms of responding specifically to your question, are there any reports? Are there any benchmark of success? I haven't seen it. And of course, maybe they're in work in progress, but I have not seen like San Francisco, any benchmark or statistics on 5 years after city was adopting CEDAW and have an ordinance where we are now. I haven't seen that.
Is there a way for WIN to maybe advocate for that at the Women's Policy, the Research Institute, and try to push for that?
This is so that's actually one of our goals this year. Is we just reactivated the Cities for CEDAW website, and then Cathryn has put together a team of civil rights lawyers in New York City to have a stronger presence at the UN, and that's one of the things that we intend to start tracking and responding to. That we were doing that at one point, and then that kind of got dispersed, but now that's our top focus right now, is implementing tracking on a global level, but mostly focused in the United States, which cities have adopted and how they're going forth. And then we want to have a team of advisors, which would be Elahe, Julianne. Actually, a lot of the panel today are the experts on that, implementing the Cities for CEDAW. Emy is another expert. So we would be responding to questions or problems that people are having. So we hope to have that rolling in the next few months. Again, it was very active, and then you know, we just all went. So that is our priority. And Cities for CEDAW website has been, Elahe oversaw that. And so it's been redesigned and reactivated, and we will be tracking all of that. And
yeah,
then
I can also tell you that just locally, I know in San Francisco, maybe Emy knows more, but in San Francisco with our, and so we have a department on the status of women, and they've completely transformed how San Francisco deals with human trafficking and violence against women. And we have had huge success. So I know that, I'm not gonna remember the exact years, but that we had 0 deaths due to violence against women until I wanna say last year. Emy, do you know for what that statistic is? I know that for several years, right, we were really able to drive down the number of women who were, number of homicides due to violence against women. So that is definitely one like huge gain that I know is probably on the website of the Department of the Status of Women in San Francisco. The other thing is so speaking of like, how do we restructure and how do we dismantle structures that are working against our rights? We dismantled the way, in San Francisco, we dismantled the way that we dealt with human trafficking and prostitution. And prostitution was no longer given any type of crime, and was not, because, sorry, I'm not, I'm not the expert on this, but women who were involved in human trafficking before the restructuring were being prosecuted as prostitutes, but they were actually the victims. So I know in San Francisco, the DA's office worked really closely with the Department on the Status of Women to ensure that victims were not also re-victimized again as criminals. So I know that that is definitely one thing that is happening in San Francisco directly because of the work of the Department on the Status of Women in San Francisco. So those are 2 examples I just know off the top of my head. The other thing I'd say to that is, I just know is going to be difficult, is that each city has its own emphasis of how they're interpreting and how they're using resources to bring the CEDAW to their own community. So in San Francisco, we focus mainly on violence against women and human trafficking. But I know that other cities like Los Angeles, for example, I think actually does more education, and then that's their focus. So I think when we are trying to look at statistics, if we're trying to compare across the board, that's going to be difficult because each city has its own emphasis and its own focus. But that being said, I think we can definitely look at data for each city. And I know that that part of CEDAW for each city is those determining what those benchmarks are, and then having some type of evaluation at regular intervals to determine kind of a pre and post impact. So yeah, anyone else?
Well, I'd like to add that, and Susan Lee, please jump in. There's been an annual meeting of Cities for CEDAW participants, and this year it was virtual, and there has been information collected based on questions, and then different parties answered in different ways. So it's not like a measurement that you would use for sophisticated research. But Charlie, you may want to look at that and combine that. I'm not sure who the new director who has taken that on. Susan, do you remember from the conversations?
No, I'm afraid I don't, Alice.
Okay. Joanne Ward in New York.
Joanne Ward. Yeah. They shared that research with us. Yeah, go ahead, Charlie. I think you might.
Can we have these detailed logistical conversations offline? This is being recorded. We're trying to create a document. So Emy had a comment to make, but I think they're really important conversations.
Yeah, go ahead, Emy.
No, I just wanted to add that when it comes to San Francisco, we have the luxury of being a city and a county. So whatever the city does it that way. Los Angeles is a huge city, but within the county, there are 118 cities.
Right.
So you can see how there could be competing interests. And also at one point, San Francisco was looking at how the budget allocates resources to women and girls. That was a part of a tenet of what CEDAW is about, is yes, violence against women, but also are we diverting resources to really help women and bring equality and equity to the services, to the work, and to the opportunities as well. So I just wanted to add that.
I just want to add that is seeing the budget of any entity, cities, county, national, any country, from with the gender sensitive lens, give us a totally different pictures. And that's one of the things that it's being, awareness on that is being promoted through various agencies of UN, because when you see how budget is responding to gender issues, then you see completely different pictures. Thank you.
I think I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes, I think following up on what Elahe was saying, I think that is one of the key issue areas that UN Women is working on. And this is the entity that combined 4 agencies dealing with women's rights issues into one body in the UN called UN Women, and with a larger budget. And that's one of the things that Elahe, you were talking about, looking at engendered budgets. And seeing how countries use their resources. It's one thing for them to make the commitment, and this is what happened in San Francisco. We had hearings and we did education from the mayor's office to the different commissions. But once they passed the city ordinance, then we said, okay, the next step is a budget.
Exactly.
And then we got the budget, and that's when they started reviewing various departments in San Francisco. For example, like Public Works. For example, that was one of the first agencies, and they said, street lights, where are they located? Things like that hadn't been thought of before, but looking at it from a gender lens. So not only doing that here in the US, but using the UN entity, UN Women, to look at that globally, looking at that, having countries to present their reports. And I haven't been involved in janebernardpowers, you know more about this in terms of, for example, the US Women's Caucus that meets when the Commission on the Status of Women meets annually. I think that would be another body to have discussions. And I know that WIN interacts with the U.S. Women's Caucus at the CSW session. So that would be another way to get that type of information.
Oh, great. Well, I think we're getting up to our time. Let's see. Charlie, do you have some closing remarks?
Sure. I was going to say that we're past our time.
Yeah.
But I do want to say that we can continue these discussions because this facility, the Zoom, we can record them and we can have in-depth discussions going on. I think this is a much easier way to connect than having phone meetings like we were just even a few months ago. So WIN is going to be having a goal to every 2 months having a panel presentation like we had, and then a slight discussion, maybe a little bit more controlled with the questions. Or we can just, on the request, have an open mic, open video where we're having an open-ended discussion about what are the barriers and how to resolve them. But I do want to thank everybody for coming today. I always want to thank Marilyn. I saw she went offline. I was hoping to have her say something, our fearless leader. Her genius, I always knew I was in the presence of a genius all the years that I spent with Marilyn as part of her team. Eileen Hernandez, Marilyn, and myself, we're kind of the nucleus focus group guiding WIN through these last 24 years. And then of course, Elahe and Julianne also were a key from the long time ago to the present.
Yeah.
And Marilyn's genius was that she had the capacity to walk into any situation and highlight the leaders, the stars in the group, and then through her persistence to pull us together in a working group going forward. We always want to acknowledge her for bringing us all together, because this panel, the work that we've done the last 25 years at state, international, and city levels has all been under her persistence and guidance, and just echoing Emy's words that to do human rights work at the big picture takes guts and it takes perseverance. You have to be very strong and very focused. And most of the people, especially in the United States, do not understand what we are talking about. So they also have a certain level of isolation within your peer group because they say, you what? So we always, that's one of our barriers, is how to create the language so the normal person, the average person, can understand what we're talking about. And that's still what we're really focusing on this year, is developing that language that the common person on the street, male, female, child, can understand. But I want to thank you all. I always feel very, very fortunate to be in the presence of such wonderful women brought to us. Of course, the Creator brought us all together, but Marilyn Fowler, in the expression of the Goddess Incarnate, did also keep us all together under incredible duress. We've stayed together under incredible duress, from pressure to disband and to fail and to lose hope. But our guiding light is to keep hope, to support each other, to continue to have that higher view, because we cannot attain a goal that we do not have. So when we have that view, that global perspective, that higher view of we are ascending and transforming as a species to a higher level of understanding and compassion and respect for all the sentient life we share this earth with, we keep that higher common goal, and that guides us in our day-to-day activities. I'm just, again, so grateful to each one of you that joined us today, and the panel, the current WIN board, our advisory board has been so amazing and lovely. Kathleen Cha and Julianne and Emy have continued to advise us, and then the new board members who've come on and are going to be really helping to get a handle on the Cities for CEDAW campaign and pretty much running it right there by the UN in New York. So thank you, Cathryn, for taking the responsibility to stepping up into a executive board position, and everyone here that came with us today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.
It was wonderful to see everyone.
Yes,
Thank
happy
you.
Women's Equality Day.
Yes.
Yes.